everybody. Welcome to another Free Thought in Florida. I'm Sarah Ray. I'm your host. I'm one of the directors of the Atheist Community of Polk County, a Florida nonprofit corporation. And we have a special guest today. We're going to be talking to Allison Gill, who is the Vice President, Legal and Policy with American Atheists. They have a new report out, the Secular Survey, and we're going to discuss that in a bit of a great detail with her. But I do want to mention, full disclosure, out of the box, the Atheist Community of Polk County is the is an affiliate of American Atheists, and also the benefactor, the producer of Free Thought in Florida. So we'll get that out of the way right out of the gate. And let's bring in our guest for today's show, Allison Gill. Allison, thank you for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it as well. I'm eager to discuss this new report.
Yeah, so I watched the webinar. When was that? Last night? That was last night, wasn't it?
It was on Tuesday, I think.
Or last, whatever day. What is today? Today's May 7th.
Who even knows anymore?
I only know this because May 7th happens to be my birthday, so it's May 7th.
Happy birthday!
But I don't know. Thank you very much. But I still don't know what day of the week that is, or really what year we're in anymore. So before we get into the Secular Survey, why don't you just, talk a little bit about you and your background, sort of what you do on the daily with American Atheists, that sort of thing.
Sure. So I'm Vice President for Legal and Policy for American Atheists. I manage our day-to-day advocacy work at the federal and state level. And I also sort of oversee our litigation work to maintain the separation of religion and government. So I report to, for example, our executive director, Nick Fish, and manage those aspects of the organization.
Awesome. So let's talk about the Secular Survey then. Give us just sort of a high level, what is the Secular Survey?
Sure. Well, the U.S. Secular Survey was a survey for non-religious people living in the U.S. that we did last year from October to November. We had about 34,000 non-religious respondents, participants from all across the country. And then this is now the first report we're publishing with that data, and it's called Reality Check, Being Non-Religious in America. So this is the report we're talking about, and it's all accessible at www.secularsurvey.org.
Is this the first sort of set of data like this of its kind, or have we had anything to sort of work from?
No, this is pretty exciting because it is first of all the largest data collection of non-religious people in America, and this is the first time we're doing this sort of in-depth dive into our community needs, challenges, organizing, policy preferences, all those different aspects of the non-religious community. Well, and so this is going to be really groundbreaking.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit too, because typically when surveying is done, the way cohorts are divided up and what communities and categories get looked at and how, the way that non-religious people get represented in that is kind of complicated, and I feel like we have to spend a lot of time explaining what that means when you're looking at that data.
No, that's a really important distinction. So several of the large population surveys that organizations like Pew Research Center and PRI do, so they look at a wide swath of the population, and then they're able to say what's representative, like what the demographics are for populations. And they group non-religious people into this sort of broader category that's called religiously unaffiliated people, or nuns. Which now is it's a rapidly growing segment of the population. It makes up about 25 or so, about a quarter of the population of the U.S. So that's been expanding over time. However, a really important distinction is that not all of those people are actually non-religious. Like I think something like 30% say that religion is very important to them, and about 60% say they believe in some sort of deity or higher being. So that's not the same as being non-religious. So the actual population of, though they also look at the categories of agnostic and atheists within that broader category, and that's closer to about 9%.
Yeah.
So really, we're talking about that smaller population, just the people that affirmatively identify with one of the non-religious labels like atheist, humanist, freethinker, skeptic, etc.
And that's good because, again, like I feel like we love to share the headlines that, get us excited and, oh, wow, look, the nuns are the fastest growing religious population, whatever. And now we've outpaced whatever it was, evangelicals and Catholics.
Yeah.
But there's more to the story. And so then I feel like we always have to be like, okay, no, but hold on, because that also means like I'm spiritual but not religious, or, I believe in something, but maybe not a God per se. The universe is my God. Or, yeah. So then you have to be like, okay, well, hang on. We got to divide this up a little more.
Yeah.
So I think what would be interesting though is to really sort of look at, especially since this is the first set of data to look at, what have we learned? Have these results really sort of confirmed what we already maybe knew, generally speaking, about the experience of being an atheist in the U.S., or were there any surprises or aha moments?
Yeah, there were all of the above. So, I think everybody brings their own anecdotes and perceptions about what life is like, and it's based on their own sort of reality for non-religious people in the U.S. But, you can't generalize from anecdotes about what things are actually like. You need real data if you're going to approach lawmakers or ask people to make changes or target programs or go seek funding. You need actual numbers and not just, stories are helpful, right? But you actually need numbers. And so we found pretty pervasive stigmatization and discrimination against non-religious people, and also concealment of non-religious identities. So people are often non-religious and are afraid to talk about it, for example, at work or in school or with their families. So we found that was very widespread. But I think the most interesting finding for me, as someone who grew up, for example, I grew up in New Jersey and I live in Washington, D.C., which are both fairly liberal areas, was the sort of dichotomy or distinction between how non-religious people are treated in non-religious communities versus how they're treated in very religious communities. And the answer, is just so much higher in terms of discrimination and stigmatization in very religious communities. And I think for those of us living in more, cosmopolitan areas, more less religious areas, it's easy to forget that. It's easy to not realize, living as an out atheist in Alabama is really hard and really challenging, and subjects a person to discrimination and stigma and, family rejection, all sorts of negative consequences. Yeah. So I think that's really important. And what's also important, just putting that aside for a second, is now that we've documented these negative things occurring, we can also measure their impact on people. Like we can say, oh, well, this results in greater rates of depression, isolation, loneliness, and also, in some cases, especially for family rejection, worse educational outcomes. So, that's the sort of thing that social scientists care about, because we can say, okay, well, these are the health repercussions, these are the education repercussions. So it's really important.
A couple of things I want to come back to in all of what you just said there. One, if you're looking for, there was a great article written up in Religion News Service. They interviewed several people, including my wife Becca, who, again, full disclosure, is an assistant state director with American Atheists and a director with the Atheist Community of Polk County. And she did a fantastic job for being one of these people that's like, why are they calling me and not Sarah? But I'm not the interview person. Talk to Sarah, but she did a great job. But all three of those stories sort of give color to that, what that experience is like in a storytelling sort of way. And those stories are also available sort of from the survey too, right? You had people that did some long form write-in responses
it was actually
as well.
Pretty amazing. I mentioned we had 34,000 respondents. We had 2 open-ended questions at the end of the survey. And normally you get maybe 5% of people writing into these things in social surveys, right? So these types of things, population surveys. This is not a population survey, but like constituent surveys. And we had about 1/3 of people wrote in, and
Wow.
not just like small amounts. Some people wrote in like big stories about how they face discrimination or the process of like coming to terms with their identity and revealing it to their, disclosing it to their friends and family. So that's over 10,000 different sort
Wow.
of stories, which is just a massive, and it speaks to the interest of not only just people in telling their stories and getting more information out there about themselves. I feel like people really do feel silenced in
Yep.
our community, and this is a way for them to get it out. And we've pulled snippets from those, open-ended questions, the answers, and we put them throughout the report, so you can read some of what people saying in the relevant sections that pertain to that issue
That's
area.
great. I like to, explain, just describe to people, and for those of you who've watched this show long enough or who know me, you can skip forward a minute. I grew up in a very small rural town in middle of nowhere, Illinois, town of 1,400 people. My high school graduating class was 32. We had no stoplights, 9 churches, 8 now, I think. And, so like everybody went to church, and I grew up Christian because that's what all the churches were. There were no synagogues, there were no mosques. We were all some variant of Christian. And then after I moved out on my own, I eventually moved down here to Florida into Polk County, which is a very, it's geographically gigantic. It's like twice the size of Rhode Island, and very spread out, very rural, very red on the political map. Lots of churches, so it's that sort of same like feel, that rural America. But then when we started this group, this organization, like I can't tell you how many people have come to us and said, like, we have been needing this. I didn't think there was anybody else here like me. And so I think that's a huge takeaway, that people do, like, and they want to tell me about their lives. Like, tell me what your experience has been. I want to hear it. And I know you need to get it off your chest because I know you haven't had anybody to talk to about it. And so I'm sure a lot of that came out in those questions on the survey too.
Absolutely. And I think you raised a really good point there. We found that about one in 5 or 22% of people that took the survey belong to a local organization, which is just fantastic, that level of involvement. But also, we found that belonging to national or local organizations is an important protective factor that reduces risk for like depression and loneliness. So that makes a big difference to have that sort of community structure, like you're talking about, and give people a chance, place opportunity to be a big part of something bigger, to build those human connections and tell their stories.
Yep. And if you're out there watching and you're thinking, like, I can't tell you how many times I hear this too, of like, we had a friend who lives over in the Tampa Clearwater area, who we were talking one day. This has been a while. But he was like, there's nothing really over here. And I was like, you're out of your mind. I can name 5 groups right now that are, near your area that you can go hang out with these people that are like-minded. If you think there's not a group in your area, type the name of where you're at and atheist or secular or humanist or whatever into the Google box, and if something will likely come up, and if not, start one, because
we also have an affiliate tracker on our website too, so you can go to atheist.org
right on the map
and get the affiliate tracker.
But find a community, and if there's not one, build one, because I think that's a huge takeaway, is that we have to have that human interaction piece as a group to help with the all of the things, but you're talking about sort of this health issues. I'm a trans person, and so the trans community has one of the highest rates of suicide and risks in mental health in general. And I think there are a lot of very strong correlations in the lived experiences of anyone in any marginalized group, really, but certainly between GRSM and the atheist communities. What does this data tell us, about that mental health sort of component among secular folks? What are we experiencing there?
Well, first of all, we had also a very high, if we look at LGBTQ people who took the survey, we found that about 23% were, LGBTQ of the participants, which was very, very high, much higher than the general population. I think we found like 3.6% were trans or gender nonconforming too, which is also remarkable. And I hope that means that secular communities are a welcoming place for LGBTQ people. I mean, that's my goal, at least.
Yeah.
Is to make sure that we work towards our joint issues together and make sure our communities are very welcoming. But as for depression, as for your question about psychological outcomes, we looked at two different types. We looked at likely depression using a sort of screening mechanism called the PHQ-2, but regardless, it's a screening mechanism that these surveys often use to sort of determine, well, should this person be flagged for further screening for depression, basically. Okay. Right. And then also we looked at social isolation and loneliness with 3 questions and created a scale to assess, how often people feel that way. So about 25% of the people in the survey indicated that they frequently have one or more indicators of the isolation and loneliness. So that was about 25%. And we also found that about 17% were sort of screened for likely depression. So that those are both, large numbers, larger than expected, unfortunately. And, when we first did focus groups to sort of build the basis for this survey, we did a series of focus groups with about 100 people at our last convention in 2019. One of the things we kept hearing over and over again was about, loneliness, isolation, because they're sort of feel like outsiders in their own community. And so that's one of the reasons we had to sort of ask about this. And so we expected a higher rate, and that's what we saw, unfortunately. Just to give you some context, and I want to just note from a scientific standpoint, this is not directly comparable, but and this changes over time too. But in the general U.S. population, about 7.2% were, had depression sometime in like the last year, I believe the stat is. So that's about twice the rate. But again, I can't really say that from a scientific standpoint. I'll tell you it's elevated.
Right. And so something that you mentioned there, I will agree, at least anecdotally, in our community here, I think the people who have found their way into the atheist community of Polk County, at least, have been either extremely affirming of trans or non-conforming identities, and if not, no, that's not what I want to say. They've all been affirming, but there have been some who just needed a little more, who didn't understand it quite, as much, but came in eager to learn about it. Sure. Tell me about what you're what must it be like to be a trans person in this, neck of the woods sort of thing. So I think that's, I hope that's true. I'm with you. I hope that's true of other groups that, that we recognize that it's the humanism piece, that we're all more alike than we are different. And, a lot of our political goals or our policy goals are really the same, and they all kind of come from a same place. So I agree. That's been my experience as well as, a trans person in the movement. I mean, I came from the LGBT movement. That was sort of my original background. I worked at places like the Trevor Project and the Human Rights Campaign. Yep. Before coming into the secular movement, and I found it to be incredibly welcoming. Yeah. So switch then into that policy. As the VP for Legal and Policy, what does all of this mean for us in terms of public policy going forward? Well, our hope is that this will be a really powerful tool to advance public policy for the separation of religion and government and for the civil rights of non-religious people in a variety of different ways. We can show where discrimination is happening. It's one thing to walk into a lawmaker's office and tell a personal story, and that could be really powerful, but it's even better if you have some data to back up what you're saying, and to sort of show who's being affected, show how people are being affected in terms of, outcomes like depression or educational attainment, and show who this is affecting. And another way to show political power, I'll talk maybe a bit later about the high rate of voting and political engagement for the community. But also we assessed questions around policy and advocacy. So we asked the survey takers
what, how they would rank different types of policy priorities. And for all the ones we asked about, most people said they're very important. Things like LGBTQ equality, access to abortion and contraception, maintaining secular public schools. And then we asked them also, of those issues, which three do you think are most important for secular groups to work on? And the three that came out on top were maintaining secular public schools. That was over 50% of people said that. So that was very, very important.
Good. Yep.
And second was opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination, which is also very, very relevant to LGBTQ people and a major issue these days. And the third was access to abortion and contraception. So ditto for that last one, especially at the Supreme Court these days.
So go ahead then and get in. I wore my atheist voter shirt. Talk about voting and the way that secular people are engaging or not. Don't want to bury the lead, but how is that? What are we noticing from the secular community, and then what do we do about it?
Sure. Well, there's a stereotype that secular people don't vote, and our research shows that that's not the case. Good. That they do. They're very politically engaged. Yep. So I think the stereotype comes from this idea we were talking about before about religiously unaffiliated people, and I think it creates some confusion. This is the problem when you group these two categories together. Yep. It creates confusion. So that if you look at religiously unaffiliated people, that group has a lower sort of voting rate than many others. However, our group, just looking at non-religious people specifically, we found that about 95% of the survey participants were registered to vote, and about 87% voted in the last election and were frequently or usually vote, basically, which is very, very high. Yep. The average rate of voting for the general populace is about 55%, just to give you context. I mean, they're not directly comparable, but that's very high, so which is fantastic. And this is useful because we can take it to lawmakers and be like, look, you should care about our opinions.
Yes. Well, and I'll tell you again, just a personal experience story. I wasn't engaged politically. I grew up in a rather privileged life, right? At the time, a white male Christian in the Midwest. So I had I carried every card. And I just didn't care. And when I started to kind of fall out of religion, I became apathetic. I was kind of an apatheist for a while. Yeah, there's probably something, but it doesn't impact my life, and it doesn't, I don't act on it. And when that really started to change, my wife and I had started doing a separate podcast where we just sort of talked about my transition, right? This is what I'm going through. Here's what it's like to go to your employer and say, hey, here's the thing you need to know about me, and changes are coming. Here's how my family reacted. Here's how all of those things, right? What it's like to go to the doctor and have that first, hormone appointment or whatever, all of those things. And so then we thought, well, that's great, because eventually you just get to a point where, okay, well, it's Thursday, I'm living my life. There's not really, there's not a lot to tell. Eventually you just
tired of talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And nothing's happening. Like nothing's new, still taking my pills. Everything's fine. But so then we started to sprinkle in some news stories about stuff in the GRSM community. And very quickly realized that every one of those news stories, almost maybe 99% of those news stories, were here's another example of some religion being shitty to queer people. Every story, right? It was bakers refusing to make cakes in North Carolina, being assholes with their anti-trans restroom bill and all of that stuff. And that's when I started becoming like politically engaged. It finally affected me, I think, is how, I think that's how it, when I look back, I'm trying to think like, oh, well, how did that, and I think that's what it is. It finally personally affected me. So now I have to be involved.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. They say that, coming out is a sort of a radicalizing experience because it's so divergent from the general population's experiences, and it's a time to sort of rethink and basically, see how different types of people are treated and feel a need to engage in that. How I got involved was kind of ridiculous. So, my first time, the first trans event I ever went to was the Philly Trans Health Conference, right, in Philadelphia. And so I was, young at the time. I was my early 20s, and I went to this one workshop in it, and everyone was like talking about all the activism that they're doing, and this was like, I don't know, 20 trans people talking about all the activism that they're doing and where and how and that sort of thing. And I just sort of walked away with like, oh, I guess this is just what trans people do. I was like, oh, okay, I don't know, I've never gone to an event before. I guess we just do activism, so I guess I should do that. So I went back, I met a few people there, and I went back to DC. I got pretty involved with the DC Trans Coalition, which was a major like grassroots group. It did a ton of good stuff, but I don't know. That's it was kind of ridiculous.
That's
but true.
Funny. Okay, so we talked about the discrimination and stigmatization and concealment, and we sort of talked about the queer community. Talk a little bit about communities of color or other marginalized minority groups.
Sure. And we did do a breakdown as sort of mostly a sampling of different populations that are disproportionately affected by the discrimination and stigma that we're seeing in the report. For example, we did non-religious Black participants, non-religious Latinx participants, LGBTQ people, ex-Muslims. We also looked at the effect on service members and veterans, and also young people. And so we saw some really remarkable statistics in a few different areas. However, it's a real goal of ours to do additional shorter reports that are just focused on some of these populations so we can explore them in greater detail. Mm-hmm. I think the first one we want to do is among young people, which there were some really striking numbers if you want to take a look at the report. Like, for example, young people were 5 times as likely to be physically assaulted because they're non-religious than anyone else in the survey, and also they were 3 times as likely to be depressed as other folks in the survey. So both of those things are very concerning, and they're also something that we can address. So that's one of the reasons we need to know these things so we can set up appropriate programs to deal with these issues.
Yep, and that's huge because as a local community organizer, we all talk to each other, and I hear from a lot of groups that one of the hardest things they find in building their community is getting younger people involved and engaged and inspired and wanting to take on leadership roles and all of that kind of stuff. But if it helps to know if there is some unmet need that's happening out there among this group of people, then we're not meeting it. Then that's there's an opportunity there for program building or helping those folks out.
Yeah, we also asked, you're definitely right. We also asked, about how local groups are, engage in different types of activities like social opportunities, volunteer advocacy. And so we asked, who's participating in those sorts of things and who wants to. And we found remarkable numbers around that. So about 1 in 5 had done at least like a social activity, but their rates of people wanting to do so were around 60%, and even higher for people looking for resources for people with children.
Yep.
So during our focus groups, we really heard that was one major unmet need, more resources for people with children.
Well, I can tell you, like, a big part of when we started the atheist community of Polk County, we had been visiting, kind of our sister group now, the Central Florida Free Thought community over in Orlando. But that's like an hour drive from where we are, and we're like at the closest corner of the county to them. So it's either Orlando this way or Tampa that way, and it's an hour drive either way. And we have a 4 and a 10-year-old, and so that so to go to a social thing once a week and a speaker session once a month and all of those other things, it was too far out of the radius for us. But also, it's what do we do with our kids while we're doing all of this stuff? And so when we sat down and said, I love those guys, but I just can't drive an hour to be engaged the way I want to be. Let's just do it. Let's make our own. What do you want it to be? And that was at the top of our list. Was, I don't want it to be adult church. I want kids to have something to do and not just sit and be bored. Let's go out and do STEM projects, and have park meetups and just play and all of that kind of stuff. That I think is that church, the stuff church does well. Right.
Mhm.
And I may be going off on a tangent here. I don't know. We'll see where the train goes. But the stuff that church does well, right? It's building communities and having stuff for the kids. And we don't want to indoctrinate them, right? But we can educate them about science and
Yeah,
related topics.
absolutely.
And just church just does that stuff really well. And they're helped along by special rules that give them exemptions and privileges and all of that stuff. And so I think for community building, it's really keying in on, the human condition and what people need, those basic social needs. And that's really what it boils down to. I don't think it's some big complicated rocket science.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And I hope this is a useful resource in that
Yeah,
way to show local groups like things they could be connecting in and the interest in that.
definitely.
And also the benefits for it. And you're right. I think when people, there's been lots of research on the benefits of, for example, attending church, but it's the same exact thing. It's about community.
Right.
And, we want a rational,
Yeah.
science-based, non-religious community is
Mhm.
just as effective
Yes.
as it's about community. It's about those human connections.
Yeah.
It's not about some sort of supernatural entity.
Right. When you get sick, somebody brings you, somebody from the church brings you soup. We can do that in a secular community,
Exactly.
Well, let me pull up the website here. Let's just take a quick look at it and talk a little bit about what all's there. So you can read. There's a summary write-up of the report, and then you can download the full report itself and really
It's about 60 pages.
dig into that data. Yeah. What else should we be looking at here when you key into the website? And can people still put their email on a list to say, when you do this again, let me know? Is that something that we're
No,
curating
but
yet?
we do have, you can take action on the website. You can send this to your lawmakers, and that will add you to our action alert system. So that's
Great.
you'll get emails to us through that way.
Okay.
And also, there's a section if you want to sort of provide your own story and talk about things that have happened to you. We'll be happy to take that as well. It's not for the survey. It's just so that's available as well. We might be able to use that in the future for example, publication or other types of mechanisms. So that's another avenue to sort of put your material on.
I'm just clicking around a little bit here where it tell lawmakers. So there's a nice little form right there that you can fill out, quick and easy.
Yeah.
And I assume it takes is this one of those ones that takes your address and matches you up to your legislators and nice. It's
Exactly.
really,
Yeah.
really easy to do. It's not going to take you a lot of time. It's not going to take you a lot of energy or effort.
And then you'll hear also in the future about other advocacy action alerts, like if something's happening in Florida, and there was a lot this year, for example.
Sorry.
uh,
Sorry for my state. Ugh.
you get it. We'll send you an alert, and you can just take action right there with 2 clicks because you're already registered. So it's very straightforward, and we really want to make it as easy as folks as possible to get engaged.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I will give you the last word. Is there anything else that you feel is important that we didn't? I don't want to go through like data point by data point, right? Let's
Sure.
talk about age and gender identity and breakdowns of all of that. But if there's something that you think is important to highlight that we didn't get to, or anything else.
One issue I wanted to talk about briefly was concealment, or like basically hiding your non-religious identity. And we measured that. It was very interesting results because there was just a lot of concealment in different places, in different contexts. But I mean, even among family of origin, about 10% of people, there was a lot of always concealed their identity.
Mm.
And the average was somewhere in the range of mostly for people here, for most of the time, concealed their non-religious identity in all these contexts. So it was very high. And that has really negative repercussions for people. It's actually detrimental to, psychological outcomes, loneliness and depression, like we were saying earlier. And we look at that in the survey. We show the differences for people, that have a high level of concealment versus those that don't. So, I also, in the LGBT sort of community, there is this tradition of coming out, of
Mhm.
being, out and open.
Yep.
And, there's not as much in the non-religious community.
Yep.
But I guess I'm just trying to flag how that can be destructive. It's both invisibilizing for our community, and it's also not helping to achieve long-run power and momentum and make ourselves more visible.
Yeah.
And it's also personally damaging. So, I just want to flag that as being an important issue. And at the same time, I think that we have to be conscious that a lot of people have to conceal their beliefs, otherwise they risk alienating close family or losing their jobs, and that's a real issue. But it's an interesting situation, and I thought it was worthy of mentioning.
Yeah, and I think there's some deeper dive that could be done in that area. I'm thinking of like one of the very first meetings we had some people come out and challenge why we put the word atheist in our organization's name. And so that was a fun conversation. But a lot of that pushback, and it was one or two people, right? It wasn't a big thing. But a lot of that pushback came from like, why, without religion, there is no need for a word, right? Without theist, we don't need atheist. So we're going to let religion carve a little hole and we're going to go stand in it? That seems silly. Or why would we organize ourselves around something we don't believe? Like that's kind of where it came from. But we had some good conversations that came out of that as far as, what claiming this label can do. And a lot of what we're doing in our organization is about changing the perceptions of what the general public thinks of non-believers or atheists. And atheist has a hot connotation to it. Just as a sidebar, Tuesday, I gave a secular invocation at the Polk County Board of Commissioners meeting.
Oh, fantastic.
And this was on the anniversary of the very first secular invocation before this commission, which happened last year. But one of our friends at the Central Florida Free Thought community did. And leading into that, our commission chair, Bill Braswell, went on the record with the news saying, I've never heard a secular invocation before, but or an atheist. I've never heard an atheist give an invocation before, but as long as there's no pig's blood or goat's heads, I think we'll be okay. Now he may have been joking, but a lot of people see us that way, right? No, we're the baby eaters, and there's just this connotation about, and what you're taught in Sunday school about what an atheist is and who we are as people is largely incompatible and incorrect with who we truly are. And so what we're doing is a lot about claiming the label and then going out there and showing, who atheists really are.
Yeah. And we did some interesting research on that actually here in the survey about how people identified themselves. And we found that atheist was the highest, most frequent label. About 95% of the survey takers identified to either strongly or to some other extent as an atheist. And that was also the highest primary identity label with about 57%. The second highest was humanist with about 14%. So that was how people, the most people saw themselves in the survey, although we intended it for a broader swath of the community.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of, yes, I'm an atheist, but maybe I put humanist first because humanist talks more about what I do believe in, So there's a lot of, I don't want to call it infighting, but there's a lot of conversation in the atheist circle, in the movement about all of these labels and who gets to use what and what they mean and all of that stuff. But I think another good question is sort of the perception versus reality issue, right? Why are people concealing their identities? Is this something that they've experienced negative backlash, and so they've gone into hiding? Or, and I'm just thinking, like in my case as a trans person, I was terrified to be, out in public, and because I have a deep voice and I don't necessarily, I don't fit the passing picture or whatever word we're using now. And so I was terrified of being in this area that I'm in that's very conservative and very rural and sort of backwards in that way. And it's been 4 or 5 years now, and I haven't had one single negative interaction. Not one. It was
Wow.
all in my head. Now,
That's
I know
amazing.
they're out there, and I know it happens because I read the news stories and we cover them on my other show.
Negative interactions. I have to tell you.
I know
just
that
quit the job when I transitioned.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, I know that stuff is out there. And so maybe I've gotten, real lucky. I don't know. But it makes me wonder, the causation. Why have these people decided to, the ones that have concealed, where does that come from? And I think that would be interesting to dig into.
well, we did a little bit in some contexts because we saw that there's higher rates of concealment where there's more stigma.
Mhm.
So we were able to show that, that's correlation. We can't show which one causes the other.
Right.
But, where there was more stigma, there was more concealment, unfortunately.
Mhm. Go ahead.
But I just want to thank, before we break, I really just want to thank Keith McCullough from Polk County, whose amazing artwork really served as an inspiration. If you look at the report, the cover of it, we sort of drew inspiration from the work that he did, and I think it's amazing. And the way he has captured the atheist and community in Polk County is just really fantastic. So, anyway, I just wanted to mention that because it was something that we specifically recognized in the report, and thanks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. His project, Faces of the Faithless, was something that just sort of organically came out of the we didn't realize there were that many of us thing that happens when you start a group in a place like this. And so the intention was to really just put a visual to how many of us there really are out here in the world, and it's just it's growing leaps and bounds, and he's just a really talented guy, and
Absolutely.
so I love it, and we're gonna keep growing it. I keep telling him, like, one of these days, buddy, we're gonna set that up in a we'll do a showcase and blow it up real big on a wall, and then you can maybe take a few of those people who are willing to tell their stories and break them out, and we'll do a whole art exhibit based around just this thing, and that'll be a great way to tell the stories of how many of us there are and what we go through and all of that stuff in a real visual way.
Absolutely. That would be really amazing. I hope there's an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so once again, the survey is at secularsurvey.org, and of course, you can learn more about American Atheists and all the work they do at atheists.org. Allison, thank you again for spending a little time with me today. I appreciate it. I know you're really super duper busy talking to media and all of that other stuff, so I appreciate you taking the time out for a little old us.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great.
Absolutely, my pleasure. All right, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Free Thought in Florida. I don't have any community announcements or anything for you today because there's really not a whole lot going on. We're just hunkering down. Be safe. If you're out there in our community and you need something, please get in touch. We'd love to be able to help you out in any way we can. If you're hurting right now, if you need something, please reach out and let us know. And we'll see you on the next episode of Free Thought in Florida.